Welcome to Christ Chapel College, the college outreach of Christ Chapel Bible Church in Fort Worth, Texas. We hope everyone experiences what Jesus calls abundant life. So we unapologetically point to Him as the source of life and joy. If you're a college student in the Fort Worth area, we'd be stoked to connect with you. Find out more at christchapelcollege.org and on Instagram at Christ Chapel College.
Hey, good morning. Happy Sunday. I feel like even before I introduce myself, I need to apologize for the shirt. Totally didn't even think about the color and the game last night, so that's my bad. Yeah, but hey, glad to be up here this morning. My name is Zach. I'm on staff here. I'm just one of the guys that gets to preach every so often. I love what Justin said. I love that we're a team, and really hope that you feel welcome this morning. Also, can't remember if it was said in the welcome, but we do have a couple of Bibles in the back if you don't have one. The text that we're going through will be on the screen, but I also think there's something really powerful that happens when we grab the Bible and flip through it ourselves. So there's a couple of those in the back of the room if you're looking for one. I would encourage you to grab it. And we're going to be in Mark 6 this morning. Mark 6, starting in verse 30. And you can start flipping there now. But before I jump into the text, I kind of wanted to set up where we're going with a reality from my own life. So I feel like sometimes when I'm teaching or getting ready to teach, there's a story from my past that I can kind of relate to what the text is trying to teach us or what it's trying to say to us. And this morning, I feel like it's not so much of a past story. It feels very much more so like it's just a constant reality that keeps popping up in my life. And even as I was prepping, I felt like it was maybe a reality that I was in even right now. Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. I feel like there are times where I just get stuck in this stagnancy, right? It just feels stagnant. It just feels like here's another week. Here's another week. There's no direction. There's no excitement. Maybe there's boredom that I feel, and I just get trapped in this stagnancy. In this, maybe a good way to describe it is a plateau. Maybe I don't necessarily feel like I'm moving backwards, like I'm moving further away, but it also doesn't really feel like I'm moving anywhere. I'm moving towards anything. And what I've realized in those moments is that when I get caught in that reality, I'm actually just not paying attention to what God is trying to do. I'm not tapped into what He's trying to do in my life. Maybe a good way to say it is I'm not tapped into the transformational life that God has for me. And so I get plateaued. I can't pay attention to how God is trying to transform me. I feel trapped in this stagnancy. I want us to see through the text this morning how Jesus transforms us, right? That's exactly where we're going. That's what Justin mentioned. We are going to see how Jesus transforms us. Because the reality is, right, if you call yourself a Christian and you've said yes to Jesus, and you look at your life and you're the same exact person that you were 6 months ago, not growing in what God calls us to grow in, still not taking any steps forward in battling sin, I would say that we're missing something. Something is off. We should be continually transformed by Jesus. So how does He transform us? How can I pay attention to God trying to transform me? How can I tap into this transformational life? Sometimes Christians will use the word, oh, it was thunder. I thought that was my mic. All right, let me lock in. Sometimes Christians will use the word sanctification, right? This fancy word sanctification, that just means transforming to look more and more like Jesus. Transforming to look more and more like Jesus. And the precursor, right? What needs to happen before that is that I've actually said yes to Him. And then the Spirit works out within me this spiritual transformation. So how can I pay attention? How can I be aware of this transformation that is available? What is Jesus trying to transform me to? I hope that we talk about a little bit of all of that this morning. So I also feel like I can track better if I have a roadmap, kind of a picture of where we're going. So let me give that to you. We'll start with some context on the passage, and then we'll break the passage into 3 clean chunks. And from each chunk, I would say there's a different way that God is trying to transform us. So hope you see that. Let's start with some context. So we've been going through the book of Mark this semester, and we'll actually be going through it through the whole year. We're going through the book of Mark. And this week is actually pretty cool. I think it's the first time ever where we're picking up right where we left off last week. So last week, the sermon was all about how we have a mission, we have a ministry, and we have a message. A mission, a ministry, and a message. And we saw that through Jesus sending his disciples out. Right? If you remember, he sent them out in groups, and they went to minister to the towns, to the crowds around them. And now, if you look at verse 30, the very first couple words, it says that apostles returned to Jesus. Right? So they were sent out, they were ministering, and now they're returning. So that's kind of where we're picking up. And the other thing I want to highlight is this. I don't mean to steal the thunder of the passage, but we're covering Jesus feeding the 5,000. That's the story that we're going to read this morning. And maybe you grew up in church and you've heard this story 100 times. But I want to show us this morning, maybe there's another way to look at this story. Maybe there's a way you haven't read this story before. I'd be curious to hear if you have ever read this story through the lens of what is Jesus trying to do with his disciples? Like, how can we view this miracle actually as a coaching lesson, as a teaching lesson for what he's trying to transform the disciples into? So how can we view it both as a powerful miracle, but also a transformative lesson? So that's where we're going. Let's jump in. This is Mark 6, starting in verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Let's stop there. So what do we see from this first chunk of the text? There's 2 observations that I want to pull from this text, and the first is this: we see that the disciples are completely out of energy, right? They are completely out of energy. Like we said, we saw them go out and they were ministering to the crowds. They were teaching and ministering to the crowds, and now they're coming back, right? They're returning to Jesus, and we see that they are out of energy. The text says that they didn't even have time to eat. Can you imagine being so busy that you don't have any time to eat? Honestly, that might be some of your reality right now. And the disciples, right, I'm assuming that this is not just like a 12-hour sending out, right? The passage from last week talks about them moving from town to town. And so I can imagine this is not just a one-day thing. This could be potentially weeks of them traveling from town to town, ministering to different towns. And so they, for weeks, have been so busy, so out of energy. And that's the first thing I want to see. And the second thing, right, what is Jesus' answer to their exhaustion? What is Jesus' answer to their exhaustion? What does he say? He says, "Come away to a desolate place and rest." Right? Come away with me to a desolate place and rest. And that leads me right into the first point I want to make. How does Jesus want to transform us? He transforms us with his gift of rest, through his gift of rest. Right? He transforms us through his gift of rest. It's a gift of rest with Jesus in a desolate place where we cut out the noises, where we cut out the distractions, and we just get to rest with Jesus in a desolate place. And I was thinking about my own life, and I can totally relate to this. Let me tell you a story. So when I was a junior in college, I was at TCU, and I was like a lot of you. I felt like my schedule was so packed. I felt like I was so busy. And I couldn't catch a break. I couldn't get my head above water. I felt like things just constantly kept coming at me. I was so exhausted. I was burnt out. And what that feeling led me to was I believed that my life would be so much better. I believed that I could get that rest that I wanted. I could be filled up again if I could just live life with time on pause for a couple of days. Does that make sense? Like I wanted to live life, my own life, where I could sleep in, binge watch Netflix, all the things, and then those couple of days, and then press play on life, and then that would make me filled up. And so that's where I was at. And then God was funny, and my junior year was when COVID hit. So I was on spring break, and we actually never went back to class. We went straight from spring break to online school. So I'm from Minnesota. I remember driving back up to Minnesota and quarantining, and especially in Minnesota, everything was shut down, right? So I'm home alone, or not alone, but I'm home, and I have no social responsibilities. I have no work or school responsibilities because they didn't even figure out how to do online school yet. And at first I was like, man, this is awesome. I get to do whatever I want. And I remember for those first 2 weeks of quarantining, I did literally whatever I wanted to, right? I slept in, I stayed up as late as I wanted to. If you think about it, every way that you can answer the question, like, did he do what he wanted in that regard, the answer was yes. Everything. And then at the end of those first 2 weeks, I remember just taking an inventory. You know, what was going on? How was I doing? And I remember feeling that my soul was more shriveled up and dead and dry, maybe than it ever had been in my whole life. Right? This pursuit of doing whatever I wanted to had left me so dry and empty, and I thought it was actually going to give me rest. And it didn't. And so I would say after those first 2 weeks, something started to change. I started to view that time not as leisure, right? A time for me to do whatever I wanted to, but I started to view that time as this desolate place experience with Jesus. I started to tap into what is Jesus trying to do with this time that I've been given where there's no noise, right? There's no extra distractions. I have this gift of rest, this gift of a desolate place experience with Jesus. How is he trying to transform me? How is he trying to grow me? And I started to ask these questions. And if you think about it, right, that's why this desolate place experience was so sweet for the disciples also. They got to come away from the crowds and just be with Jesus, experience Jesus in an uninhibited way, maybe than like it was intended to be, right? This uninhibited relationship with Jesus. And I can point to that summer for me as an explosion of my spiritual growth. Right? I started to tap into Jesus and hear his voice and see how he's trying to transform me, and that led to an explosion of spiritual growth. And so then the question becomes for us then, how can I create this desolate place experience with Jesus? How can I create this desolate place experience, this desolate place rest? And I think that the answer to that question is why our trips are so popular, right? Like going to fall break up in Broken Bow and Belize. We get to cut out the normal rhythms of life, and we get to experience Jesus maybe in a way that we don't often think of when we cut those daily rhythms out. But I would hate for the application to just be these retreats and trips. I also think that there are daily and weekly habits that we can pursue to create this desolate place rest with Jesus. I think the pursuit of this rest is why people wake up early, right before the world wakes up, before I check my phone, and I just get to spend time without the noise, without the distractions with Jesus. I also think it's why Sabbath is such a pursuit that people prioritize, where I get these extended periods of time where I'm reminded that I am designed to be at rest with Jesus in some capacity. So kind of transitioning out of this point, I would love to ask you this question. How have you experienced rest in the desolate place with Jesus? Have you experienced rest like this in the desolate place with Jesus? Because I believe that rest was the fuel for the spiritual transformation of the disciples. And it was also, I can testify, the fuel for my explosion of spiritual transformation that summer. And I have seen time and time again that it can be the fuel for our spiritual transformation if we tap into what God is trying to do with us in those gifts of rest. So have you experienced it? The first way he's trying to transform us is through this gift of rest. So for this second point, I want to do something a little different. I want to give you the point first, and then we'll read the text. So the second way that Jesus is trying to transform us is toward a heart of compassion. Toward a heart of compassion. So that's how he is transforming us. Now let's look at the text and see where we see that. This is picking up in verse 33. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." So what's going on here in this next chunk? What do we see? Right, we see that the disciples were with Jesus, right, in this desolate place, and they're traveling in their boat. And the crowds, right, they see where the boat is headed, and before the boat even gets there, they get to the shoreline waiting for Jesus, right? The crowds are so eager to be in Jesus' presence. And remember that. I think that's important. They're eager to be in Jesus' presence. So he goes ashore, and he starts to teach them. And after he's been teaching them for a while, right, it starts to get late. Yeah. It starts to get late. And the disciples, right, what do they suggest? What do they suggest that he does with them once it starts to get late? He says, send them away, right? Send them away so they can go out and buy food for themselves. Okay, so think about this point, right? He transforms us toward a heart of compassion, and then think about what the text we just read, and you might be thinking to yourself, like, how does that relate, right? We don't really see the disciples showing compassion, but honestly, that's the point that I'm trying to make, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. The disciples miss this opportunity to show compassion, right? We get this sweet picture, this contrast of how Jesus deals with the crowds versus how the disciples deal with them. Jesus is trying to transform the disciples to have this contagious compassion, and the disciples miss it. I mean, think about this. That word desolate in verse 35, it's used again, right? But this time, it's used in a negative context, right? The disciples literally just experienced how sweet and uninhibited time with Jesus in a desolate place was, and now in verse 35 they're saying send the crowds away because it's a desolate place, right? They've completely missed the point. This is a cool picture that we get, right? This contrast of how the disciples respond versus how Jesus responds. And if I'm being honest, right, I miss opportunities to show compassion all the time, right? I miss opportunities to show compassion all the time. I'm just like the disciples. I was trying to think of a story from my own life where I missed it, and then humbly, God reminded me there was too many to pick from, right? I think about times where I had a service person over to my house, right, like an electrician or a plumber, or someone was putting insulation in our roof, and I didn't see that as an opportunity to show Jesus' compassion to someone else. I think about times where we've had people over for dinner, or I get coffee or lunch with someone, and I just completely let that opportunity slip by. Like, I didn't go into that opportunity thinking, how can I, in this time, show Jesus' compassion to this person? I think about times where I'm in group settings, and I see someone who's on the outside, and I think to myself, I don't step in and make them feel welcome, make them feel invited, make them feel at home. I even think about times where I maybe did show compassion, but it was a reactive compassion, right? Why did it take me reacting to something to then be compassionate? Why couldn't I have led proactively with compassion? Why couldn't I have gone into the situation desiring to show Jesus' compassion? So if we start to look at our lives more and more, right, we are just like the disciples, missing time to show compassion. And I really think that if we can continue to grow in recognizing those opportunities and grow in our showing of compassion, that correlates with our spiritual transformation, with our spiritual growth. Let me also just pause for a second. I want to acknowledge I want to acknowledge that some of you are in this room and you're not at all thinking about how is Jesus trying to transform me, right? You're not thinking about that at all. Maybe you are in this room and you are just still checking this out. You haven't said yes to him, and so you're not even thinking about this transformation. But there's also some of you who are in this room and it just feels like transformation is not even possible. You just feel so far from Jesus that transformation you don't even know what transformation would look like. And this is the point that I would want you to lean in on. I would just love for you to sit in this place and hear the compassion that Jesus has for you, the compassion that Jesus leads with. If you look at verse 34, I would underline like the whole back half of verse 34, right? This is what we see. This is what we see. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. I would say that the reason that they are described as sheep without a shepherd is maybe they feel lost, maybe they feel lonely, maybe they feel directionless, right? And what do we see? We see that Jesus meets them with compassion. He doesn't judge them. He doesn't condemn them in any way. He's not frustrated by the crowds waiting for him. He meets them with compassion. He leads with compassion. And he views each one of us the exact same way. When he sees us, he leads with compassion. And I also love this interaction with the crowds and with Jesus because it shows us that it's not about what the crowds have accomplished. Right? The text doesn't say that the crowds have accomplished anything great. It's not about how far ahead they are or how good of a person, how good of people they are, right? It's about how Jesus has compassion on them because he sees their spiritual need and he steps in, right? He leads with compassion. His compassion isn't based on their accomplishments or their progress or even an understanding, right? It's not based on the understanding of who he is. He leads with compassion, and he starts to teach them. And that's the whole point of what we believe as Christians, right? I love what Justin said in the welcome. I bring nothing to my salvation. I cannot do anything to earn my salvation, right? The requirement for eternity with God, for heaven, is living a perfect life. No, there's not a single person who could live a perfect life except for Jesus, right? 2,000 years ago, the God of the universe sent his son, Jesus, who lived the perfect life, died the perfect death, and with his perfect life, death, and resurrection, he purchased for us an opportunity to be back in relationship with a God who leads with compassion. Right? My sin, the wrath that my sin deserves was poured out on the cross. My sin no longer receives that wrath if I have said yes to Jesus. I get to experience the compassion that Jesus leads with. And when I get to experience this compassion, I'm not left where I am. Right? God does not see me where I am and he leaves me there. He does start to transform my life. My life is continually transformed to what life looks like, the way that he designed it, right? What we would say life and life abundant. That is what my life starts to be transformed into. So let me ask you these two questions. First, have you experienced this compassion? Have you experienced the compassion that Jesus has towards you? Have you experienced this sympathetic concern for your suffering, for your trials, for the things that are hard in life? Have you experienced the God of the universe leading with compassion, the God of the universe calling you his son, his daughter, right? Not viewing God as a God who has his arms crossed up in the sky, who's mad at you, but one who leads with compassion, but also through that compassion leads us to transformation. So have you experienced the compassion that Jesus has towards us? And second, very similar, are you growing in this compassion towards others? Are you letting this compassion that you have experienced be contagious? Are you letting it pour out of you to then affect those around you so that they see the love that Jesus has for them in how you love them. He transforms us toward a heart of compassion. He desires for us to grow in this contagious compassion. Are you growing towards more and more of this compassion? I want to read the last chunk here. This is 37 through 44. Let's jump in and see how this ends. But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. So what we see in this last chunk, right, is the actual feeding of the 5,000. And I want to clarify quickly before we get too deep, that phrase 200 denarii worth, if you read other translations, sometimes that's helpful with like understanding the passage. Other translations sometimes translate that as half a year's wage. So that makes sense, right? You're feeding 5,000 people all at once. You can imagine how much money that would cost. And think about it, right? The disciples are maybe understandably hung up on this point of money, right? Like it's a seemingly reasonable hang up, thinking about dropping this much money all at once. But they're also forgetting who they're with, right? They're forgetting that they're literally with Jesus, the guy that they have seen perform miracles, and not only seen perform miracles, but also given them authority to go out and teach, like we saw in the last passage, and the guy that they've seen provide for them. And so they're continuing to miss that they're with Jesus, who, of course, has the ability to do this. But here's where I want to zoom in. Look at the very first thing that Jesus says, right? After they suggest that they send the crowds away in verse 36, look at what Jesus says. The very first thing he says, you give them something to eat. You feed them, right? He doesn't say, let's feed them. He doesn't let us together feed them. He doesn't say that he is going to feed them. He puts it on them. He says, you feed them. And then, they kind of have this exchange, and Jesus prays before the food starts to be multiplied, which I think is important. But then, right, look at verse 41. Verse 41, he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. See, we see that Jesus isn't the one that's passing out the loaves even. He said, you feed them, and then he gave the food to the disciples to pass out. So here's the point that I want to make. Jesus transforms us with our participation. With our participation. He's asking the disciples to participate in the miracle, right? It's an invitation to participate. And in participating, right, in their participation, they are being grown spiritually. They're being grown spiritually by their participation. And let's clarify this for a second. Jesus is the one that's doing the miracle, right? The miracle is not contingent on the disciples being there, right? The miracle would have happened regardless, even if the disciples weren't there. The 5,000 people would have been fed. But God chooses to allow the disciples to participate, right? Jesus chooses to allow the disciples to participate. And I think about this for my own life. There are times where I'm blown away. God could have accomplished however he wanted. He could minister to people however he wanted to. He could reach people however he wanted to. And yet, he is calling me to participate. He is allowing me to participate in this action of kingdom activity. I'm blown away. I don't even deserve, right? We talked about, I don't deserve even a seat on the bus of what he is doing. And yet he calls me to have a front row seat, to participate. And through me, right, he starts to work. And I think about also, there's times in my life where I'm called to participate maybe in the deep end. Like I'm thrown in the deep end and I am totally unprepared for the ways that God is calling me to participate. Right? I'm uncomfortable, you might say. And I think this uncomfortable feeling comes because we aren't totally in control. Right? It's this uncomfortable feeling. But I would say that that uncomfortable feeling is actually the feeling of us being grown spiritually. I had a coach growing up said something to us that I will never forget. He said, we need to be people who are comfortable with being uncomfortable. How can I be someone who is comfortable with being uncomfortable? How can I shift my mindset to see that the uncomfortable times when God is calling me to participate, that participation is growing me spiritually? I'm being grown spiritually to look more and more like Jesus. That uncomfortable feeling is actually the feeling of spiritual transformation and spiritual growth. And I want to illustrate this point a little bit further. I want to talk about how do I make sure that I don't miss it? How do I make sure that I'm ready for the call to participate when the call happens? So think about it this way. I heard it taught this way, and I think this is a super, super good way of thinking about it. So think about being on a sailboat. Think about you're on a sailboat on the water. And think about how does that sailboat, how does it move forward? Usually a sailboat doesn't move forward with rows. Usually it doesn't have a motor. The way that a sailboat usually moves forward is by catching the wind. And so if I want to be, thinking back to this point, if I want to be ready to participate, I need to make sure that metaphorically my sails are up to catch the wind. If my sails aren't up, if I'm not, for example, in my Bible or in prayer, if I'm not doing things that is teaching me what the voice of God is, I'm going to miss these opportunities when the gust of wind comes by that's calling me to participate. And right, it's this phrasing is with our participation, right? It's this sweet thing that happens. God is not going to rip things out of our, well, he might, but it's not going to be this mean-spirited God who condemns us and makes us change, right? It's with our participation. It should be this sweet partnership of growing more and more like Jesus. And also, I want to make this point that we're not always called to participate when it's convenient, right? There are some pretty inconvenient times when God calls me to participate, but in those inconvenient times, either I'm being grown. So my wife and I, this is an example. My wife and I, when we got married like 2 years ago, we had written a marriage mission statement. And basically what that means is everything we do with our marriage, with our family, we want to fall somewhere in that mission statement. And if it doesn't, then we should start to question, why are we doing it? And one of the things that we have in our marriage mission statement is that we want to be interruptible. We want to be interruptible. We don't want to be so white-knuckled with our schedule, with the things that we have planned out, that in this planning we miss what God is trying to call us into participation. Right? How can I be someone that's more interruptible is a good way to think about that. So let me ask you this question. Where is God calling you to participate? Where is God calling you to participate? Another way to think about it, I would say, is this. Where are gusts of wind, gusts of kingdom activity just passing you by? Where are there gusts of wind where God is trying to call you into participation that you are just letting pass by? Where is God calling you to participate? He transforms us with our participation. He's calling you to participate, and you will be transformed spiritually. So how do we make sure we recognize it? Here's how I want to close. I want to remind us of where we've been. We have been in Mark 6, and we studied Jesus feeding the 5,000. And we see that this feeding of the 5,000 is of course, a powerful miracle. But we also see what Jesus is trying to coach and correct and teach and ultimately transform his disciples in through the lesson of how Jesus responds and interacts with the crowds. So if we see that the disciples were sent out, right, and then they come back, they experience this rest, and then they see how Jesus has compassion and how he calls them into participation, right? So for us, he transforms us through his gift of rest. He transforms us towards a heart of compassion, and he transforms us with our participation. And I also want to close with this reminder. I can't force my own transformation. Right? I am not ultimately in control of my own transformation. I can't control it. In the same way that I can't make myself more righteous, I can't make myself, I also can't make myself transform. I can't force that transformation. See, the reality is, like we talked about, when I submit to Jesus, it's Christ in me that works out this transformation, right? It's Christ in me that works this out. So when I'm in those times where I've plateaued, where I feel stuck, I want to start to pay attention to my disciplines of rest, with Jesus, the compassion that he is calling me to, and I want to pay attention to the areas that he's calling me to participate. Let me pray. God, I just thank you that you see us, and you see us how we are, and you don't leave us there. I just praise you that you are a God who transforms us continually, but you lead with compassion. God, I pray that you would just even remind us now that you are a God that leads with compassion. You are not a God who is quick to condemn. You are not a God who is displeased with us. God, if we are chasing after you, you lead with compassion. Help us to be transformed. Help us to recognize the areas that you are trying to transform us, God. Help us to just look more and more like you for your glory. Help us to remember that it's not us. We can't force it. It's you who just wills this transformation for us. Help us to partner better with you in this transformation. We love you. Amen.